is Barbara Weinstein. She's the Silver Professor of History at New York University, past president of the American Historical Association, and a scholar of post-colonial Latin America, Brazil, labor, slavery and emancipation, gender and sexuality, race and national identity. She's the author of many articles and books, including Social Peace in Brazil, Industrialists and the Remaking of the Working Class in Sao Paulo, 1920 to 1964, and The Color of Modernity, Sao Paulo, and the Making of Race and Nation in Brazil. Her research has received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. In 2017-2018, she was a fellow at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, where she worked on an intellectual biography of the pioneering Latin American Frank Kennedy.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in this extremely interesting and highly depressing event. And thank you also particularly to Philip Hauser for helping us all arrange to be here. I am going to read my talk in the interest of trying to stick somewhere close to the time limit. Also, I wanted to show you a few PowerPoint images, but we couldn't get it to work. So I'm going to do like this, you know. And so, those of you with bad eyesight, I'll show it to you later. But so, right in early 2011, longtime observer of Brazilian politics, Emer Sader, claimed, following Dilma Rousseff's easy presidential victory, that Dilma had, quote, inherited not just a country in much better shape than Lula did 8 years ago, but also a weakened, demoralized, and defeated right wing, unquote. I'm sure he regrets every single day having written that sentence. Yet just 5 years later, not only had Dilma's popularity plummeted, by the way, in Brazil, the convention is to call politicians typically by their first name, unless you hate them. So I will always refer to Bolsonaro as Bolsonaro. So it's not, it's a show of affection rather than the opposite. That Dilma's popularity had not only plummeted, but she had been impeached and forced from office. And this past January, Brazil inaugurated a far-right politician, someone who for years was a virtual leper in mainstream politics. My apologies to lepers for comparing them to him as its president. Still, back in 2011, Sader was hardly alone in his opinions. Most commentators back then regarded the political spectrum as ranging from slightly right of center to a few degrees left of center, and that was it. Despite a couple of serious corruption scandals involving his party, the PT, the Workers' Party, Lula left office with an approval rating well over 80%, a degree of popularity that was largely because the economy was booming, the middle class was growing by leaps and bounds, or at least people who considered themselves to be middle class. And a majority of the poorest Brazilians had been lifted from absolute misery to a condition that allowed them some security and dignity. Brazil was not only one of the BRICS, but perhaps the brightest star of them all, given its combination of economic prosperity, declining inequality, and democratic practice. My point here, of course, is to underscore how impossible it would have been for anyone to forecast Brazil's political trajectory over the last 6 years, but also to offer a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks the forces of reaction are going to go on a permanent vacation. Without claiming too much for my own powers of prognostication, I will say that I was never entirely convinced that Brazil had entered a new era of progressive democratic politics in which the major political factions shared similar assumptions and followed the same rules. Soon after that conversation, I was writing the conclusion of my book. Soon after a conversation with someone who pointed me to Sader's article. I was writing the conclusion for my book on race and regional identity and noted the division between the more prosperous south of Brazil and the more impoverished north in the most recent presidential election. A division that had begun with Lula's re-election in 2006 and then become even more acute in the two subsequent presidential elections. Given that the years of Lula's presidency had been good ones for middle-class Brazilians, it seemed worrisome that a majority of them could not bring themselves to vote for a mildly left-wing party that had been at least partly responsible for their newfound prosperity. And while it might have seemed like an isolated case, I kept coming back to the tweet by a Paulista law student, no less, following Dilma's first election to the presidency, which was the third Workers' Party victory for the presidency. Quote, "Do São Paulo a favor, strangle a nordestino, a person from the Northeast, to death," unquote. In other words, well before the economy crashed, there were troubling signs of regional and class antipathies. So I think I'll just show you now that again, I don't know how many of you will be able to see it, but this is the electoral map. The red is for states. Now, there's no electoral college in Brazil, so this is just a popular vote, but which party got the majority in the popular vote. And since Brazil has a two-round electoral system, the second round is always just two parties, the two leading vote winners. As you can see, the first election when Lula won in 2002, virtually the entire country is red. There's one tiny state in the Northeast that went for the less left, it's sort of centrist opposition candidate. But by the next election, 2006, you can see that the country is already exhibiting a regional split, with almost all of the North and Northeast going for Lula, and almost all of the South and the West going for his opponent. And then again in 2010, in Dilma's first election, so you can see now it's really becoming solidified that in every election, the southern states, the more prosperous states, higher standard of living, and states which at least think of themselves as whiter than the rest of Brazil, even if some of them are not necessarily whiter than the rest of Brazil. So you can see once again, and then this is even as recently as 2014, when Dilma is reelected by a relatively small margin. The map is almost exactly the same. The only difference is the federal district this time went for her opponent rather than for her. But it's still mainly falling into this, binary. And then finally, this is the map for Bolsonaro's victory. It's shaded, but you can still see the difference now is that he hasn't won any of the northeastern states, but he's won some of the northern states. And of course, he won bigger majorities in the other states. Since this is hard to see, I won't show you yet another map, which is in some sense even more impressive and really forces us to move away from thinking about a kind of unified causality of any sort, which is a map that shows how the cities voted in the most recent election for Bolsonaro and Haddad, his Workers' Party opponent. And what it shows is that Bolsonaro was even more likely to win a majority in the big capital cities of every state than he was in the state as a whole, including states in the Northeast, some states in the Northeast, where Haddad won the majority of the votes, but not in the urban centers. Precise opposite of the pattern that we saw in the United States with Trump's election. I think it's important to acknowledge the prior existence of this substrate of resentment, or else what I would argue, what I propose to argue in the rest of this talk might sound like I'm expounding some sort of conspiracy theory in which exquisitely clever and opportunistic right-wing schemers manage to dismantle a progressive democratic political sphere and replace it with an ultra-right regime. Even with this simmering subterranean politics of resentment, it took much more than right-wing scheming to undermine the status quo in the early 2010s. But fortunately for the right and its sympathizers, and unfortunately for everyone else, Brazil was hit by a perfect storm, a dramatic economic downturn provoked mainly by a fall in commodity prices, a massive corruption investigation known as Car Wash or Lava Jato, and a surge in violent crime. And needless to say, these are not unrelated phenomena. This is not even to mention the unexpected repercussions of the previously unknown Zika virus, which served as a toxic garnish on a plate already full of misery. let me be clear that I certainly do not mean to imply that these three major factors were simply bolts from the blue. While the economic recession was partly a result of factors beyond the government's control, both long-term economic policies and short-term political conflicts helped deepen its severity. So you have the phenomenon where the Congress is repeatedly blocking every attempt Dilma is making to address the economic problems because they want her to crash and burn. Similarly, Lava Jato now seems, the car wash scandal now seems a predictable outcome of the structure of politics in Brazil that emerged from the 1988 Constitution, which in its zeal to allow for the formation of new political parties also created whole new opportunities for graft. And the rising crime rate tracked closely the rise in unemployment. Clearly for Lula's successor, Dilma Rousseff, the shifting state of things between her re-election in 2014 and her impeachment in 2016 could not have been more inauspicious. But her impeachment in itself did not bring a new populist ultra-right-winger to power. Indeed, her immediate replacement, Vice President Michel Temer, arrested last week, I might mention, on corruption charges, was so persistently unpopular that his approval ratings were on life support. At one point, when his approval rating was 3%, a dear friend of mine in Brazil pointed out that the margin of error was 3%, so that his actual approval rating might be 0. But Dilma's impeachment, which I think probably is mathematically impossible. But Dilma's impeachment allowed a Congress in which the right wing now constituted a majority to pass a series of reforms that stripped workers of long-established rights, allowed outsourcing at every level, and froze social spending for a period of 20 years. Significantly, it did not reform the pension system, a move that would have mainly affected the middle class and retired civil servants. Still, given Temer's low approval ratings and the numerous right-wing politicians, as well as left-wing politicians who got caught up in the Lava Jato investigations, there was no reason to expect the right to sweep into power in the 2018 presidential elections. And as recently as last May, almost everyone I knew was insisting that Bolsonaro, known mainly for his crude extremist pronouncements, his endorsement of torture and illegal executions, and his flagrant racism and sexism, could never rise above 20 to 25% in the elections. And again, since Brazil has a 2-round electoral system, that would be a fatal problem. I think the combination of Lula's imprisonment, so many of you may know that Lula's been in prison for several months now, and he could run for re-election. You can't run after 2 terms, you can't run for immediate re-election, but you can run after a pause. That Lula's imprisonment left the Workers' Party without a viable candidate, and the near fatal stabbing of Bolsonaro on September 7th of last year helped transform him from one candidate among many to the front runner. And it helped feed a certain kind of mythic quality that his followers attribute to him. They actually chant, "Me too, myth, myth," at his rallies. So in effect, I would argue that the circumstances that brought Bolsonaro to power involved so many twists and turns that they can hardly be attributed to a right-wing master plan. But we still need to ask what made someone with such overtly ultra-right politics appealing or palatable to large sectors of Brazilian society, especially to white men. In that way, it is like Trump's election, but certainly not only white men. And where did all these ultra-right politicians come from who have so quickly, if deeply incompetently, populated the positions of power and influence in the new regime? And what explains the intense rancor toward the Workers' Party, not so many years after Lula left power with sky-high approval ratings? And finally, what does this all mean for the future of democracy in Brazil and Latin America more generally, and for our conversation today? There are, as you would imagine, many people doing research on this, but the work I find most interesting is being done by Ben Cowan, who previously wrote in his 2016 book, Securing Sex, about the role of right-wing moralists in the 21-year military regime that came to power in 1964. Moralists who were concerned about sex, drugs, and rock and roll and their impact on Brazilian youth. Some of Ben's subsequent work focuses on the post-authoritarian period, the period since 1985, and especially the emergence and influence in recent Brazilian politics of the BBB caucus, the Bancada BBB, with the B, it works in English, the B's stand for Beef, Bible, and Bullets. And I think it's almost like a template for the way in which certain kinds of populism have emerged, particularly in Latin America. The beef refers to the agricultural sector, which even when Emir Sada had made that unfortunate comment about the death of the right in Brazil that I opened with, even at that time he would have probably said, yes, the one bailiwick for really right-wing politicians in Brazil continues to be the large-scale agricultural sector, the agribusiness, particularly related to large sugar plantations and to soybean farming. So and even Dilma tried to kind of create an alliance with them because of the importance of that sector of the economy to federal revenue. The Bible, of course, refers to the right wing, to some extent the right wing of the Catholic Church, but really, of course, to the evangelical churches, whose congregations in Brazil have grown exponentially since the long economic recession of the 1980s. The evangelicals' ability to reach large segments of the population, whether because of their money, their access to the media, or their message, makes them a perfect ally for a rising right-wing populist. Bullets also obviously refer to the law enforcement and military and the arms industry, whose adherents and advocates blame high crime rates on the excessive constraints on the Brazilian police, really. A police which of course is distinguished internationally for its high rate of killing Brazilian citizens, but they are too restrained by this in this discourse. And also the fact that it has become very difficult to own handguns in Brazil since the gun reforms of the Lula period. So they want much easier access to handguns, and they want the police to have a free rein in terms of crime control. I do want to say that the concern about crime in Brazil is not like the concern about crime in the United States. I mean, I think it's absolutely ludicrous that I need to have a card to get into the up into my room in the elevator in the Homewood Suites. That's a completely unnecessary form of security. But in Brazil, that would not be the case. Every Brazilian I know has been the target of some degree of violent crime in their lifetime. So violent crime is a serious problem in Brazil, not a phony problem, as it is for most people in the United States. Certainly for me living in Manhattan, it might as well be Disneyland. It's so safe. So, but what I find most significant about Cowan's research is his exploration of the long-term process by which a particular kind of right-wing politics emerged in both the US and Brazil. And let me say emerged in tandem. I want to make it really clear, this is absolutely not my saying that the reason there are problems in Brazil is because of the United States. I mean, this was a joint effort that Brazilian elites were just as eager to participate as US elites. Many of the elements of this right-wing coalition existed in an earlier era, he argues, but it's really from the late 1980s on that you see this particular convergence of a hyper-moralistic religious right that allies with or adopts the most extreme version of neoliberalism, at least with regard to social, educational, and environmental sectors or issues in society. In a recent published article, Cowan traces the links between the International Policy Forum, the brainchild of religious conservative Paul Weyrich, from the United States, who was a co-founder of the Heritage Foundation and the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, and coined the term moral majority, and various Brazilian conservatives connected to the far-right organization Tradition, Family, and Property, including the prominent Catholic conservative Plínio Correia de Oliveira. So there are major figures on both sides. I think what his Brazilian colleagues found particularly attractive was, then this is in the aftermath of the military regime, was Weyrich's commitment to maintaining a minimal democratic process and civilian-led rule while stripping democracy of any capacity for transformative politics and immunizing it from social demands, whether for services associated with the welfare state or redistributive policies. In contrast to earlier ultra-right movements which insisted on the centrality of the strong state, this merger of the religious right and neoliberalism preached a minimalist, deregulating state with the exception of the keeping the forces of order strong, and a judicial system primed to engage in what I have called elsewhere lawfare, which is a term that now circulates a great deal. But again, as recently as the early 2010s, a reasonable observer could have concluded that the right in Brazil was barely registering its presence, again being confined mainly to the soybean frontier and the evangelical churches. So we need to consider in somewhat greater detail what made this whiplash-inducing shift from a mildly left-wing series of governments to an extreme right-wing presidency possible. I mean, there are awful things happening on politics all over the world, but I'd say Brazil is my candidate for just the most head-snapping recent history. The easiest answer is the dramatic economic recession, but that requires us to consider why Brazil suffered such a severe economic downturn at a time when globally economies were perhaps not thriving, but they were generally not crashing. Here I would have to cite the decision by Lula and his economic advisors to maintain many of the fundamental neoliberal policies that had been implemented by previous presidents. To be sure, Lula did not adhere to austerity budgets to the same degree as his predecessors and was downright profligate in soliciting both the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Summer Olympics, something everybody would now agree was a terrible mistake, even putting aside the horrible loss to Germany in the World Cup, which at the time seemed tragic, but now we have much more serious tragedies to think about. But he linked social spending to revenues from major exports, iron ore, soybeans, petroleum, and settled on an economic strategy that seemed to benefit rich, poor, and those in the middle. As Perry Anderson noted, Lula opted for an economic program that was not supposed to cause anyone pain, and that had major rewards for elites in certain sectors and greatly expanded consumption. He tripled the minimum wage, there was easier credit, he overvalued the Brazilian real, the Brazilian currency, to cheapen imports. The two most cited socioeconomic accomplishments of his administration are the massive expansion of at least what was designated as the middle class, and the lifting of millions of Brazilians out of extreme poverty through what's called Bolsa Familia payments to families who keep their children in school. But little thought seems to have been given to how to sustain these achievements if commodity prices plummeted. Considering his sky-high approval ratings when he left office in 2010, one would expect his anointed successor, Dilma Rousseff, to post-election returns that would turn the electoral map solid red once again. But instead, what we saw was a continuation, even a hardening of that pattern I showed you, the maps, that first emerged in 2006. So what we are witnessing, I would argue, is a regionalization of Brazilian politics and a concomitant regionalized resentment that had, and this goes back, I think, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but you mentioned how it can be insiders, not, people inside the nation who become outsiders. And I think here, this sort of regionalized resentment, the nordestinos, the poorer people who tend to migrate to the south of Brazil, they function as immigrants would in other countries. So this regionalized resentment had its principal base in the relatively new and precarious urban lower middle class that ironically had benefited considerably from Lula's policies, but who eagerly attributed their upward mobility to their own hard work and personal efforts. And I want to say, I don't want to dismiss the fact that many of them in fact worked hard and it was personal, but of course, I think part of it is also their connection to evangelical churches. So that, I don't want to overstate this, but I think in the context of Catholicism, there is always at least some underlying sense of good fortune and being thankful for your good fortune. The evangelical churches, of course, it's all about, you work hard, and the people who don't have what you have aren't good Christians and aren't working as hard as you are. And so that's, again, I think that when we think about the impact of economic downturns or economic struggle, one of the things we have to look at is how people are casting this. And so that, again, cause, and particularly economic causes, have to be mediated by so many levels, but layers of other things going on, that I think we should always keep that in mind. And so increasingly, not only do they see this as a result not of any government largesse, but of their own hard work, but they also depict those getting handouts, like the Bolsa Familia from Lula and the Workers' Party, as bums. Despite their welfare queens, to use an old American term, despite Lula's attempt to portray his policies as offering prosperity for all, the vision of Brazilian society as a zero-sum game persisted and steadily fueled resentment, particularly among those whose attempts at upward mobility had been stalled or frustrated. To some extent, this resentment tracked racial identity, with white or whitish Brazilians griping about benefits for Nordestinos, for Northeasterners, who were generally perceived as less white and less modern, as well as affirmative action policies in access to government jobs and universities, as well as the granting of lands to communities that could claim either indigenous descent or descent from slave communities, who are referred to as quilombolas. And this last issue became particularly tense as these communities, the number of these communities grew, and they start to abut against the frontier of soybean expansion. Up until then, it hadn't been that big an issue, but then it starts being a big issue. It's not surprising that one of Bolsonaro's most spectacularly racist comments was about the members of Quilombo community, the descendant of slaves community, which he made, by the way, at the Jewish Community Center in Rio. And many middle-class Brazilians, both longstanding members of the middle class and the newly arrived, resented the measures taken to ensure that domestic workers, a much-desired perk of middle-class existence, received higher pay and enjoyed better working conditions as a result of Workers' Party reforms. These various developments fanned regional resentment and intensified a sentiment that had long preceded Lula's presidency, the idea that São Paulo and its southern sister states was the center of hard work and enterprise, and the rest of Brazil liked to party and take it easy and live off some phantom jobs or government largesse. The symbol that's often used with São Paulo as Brazil's locomotive, and sometimes that's accompanied by the claim that the rest of Brazil, except for the rest of the South, are empty boxcars. So. Once again, I think it's important to emphasize that such sentiments were intensifying well before the economic recession that began in 2013. But of course, that downturn really lit a fire under regional resentment as middle-class Brazilians perceived themselves as being at risk of falling back into the ranks of the poor. That then meant that there was already a substantial portion of the population prepared to demonize the Workers' Party when the corruption scandals broke amidst the disastrous overspending for the World Cup and the Olympics. This demonization was then actively encouraged by opposition politicians. The opposition, having failed to dislodge the Workers' Party from power in 4 straight elections, did everything it could to take full advantage of this moment of obvious weakness. The result electorally has been dramatic, even breathtaking. Not only did regionalized middle-class resentment form the core of Bolsonaro's support, but again, in contrast to Trump, it allowed him to get significantly higher percentages of votes in big cities, even in the Northeast. I think those focused on the US case tend to see youth and urbanity as automatically linked to a rejection of the kind of white homophobic nationalism associated with the right, but that's definitely not the case in Brazil. So what does Bolsonaro's election by a robust margin of 10 million votes mean for Brazil and for Latin America more generally? Let me end by sketching as briefly as I can some of the implications of a right-wing populist presidency committed to the moralism, deregulation, and violence that informs the BBB caucus,
with regard to gender, race, the environment, and academic freedom. I may not get into all of this because I'm running out of time. Sorry. In certain respects, Bolsonaro's candidacy and campaign style would seem to indicate that he'd gone out and made an unaccustomed visit to a bookstore and purchased a handbook on how to be a successful right-wing politician. And he went through the list, ticking off racist, homophobe, hyper-pro-Israel, etc. But let me say that Bolsonaro comes to his role as a right-wing hate monger honestly. He has been distinguishing himself through his racist, sexist, and pro-military rhetoric since the 1990s. This, I think, gives him a well-earned aura of authenticity, in contrast to somebody like Michel Temer, who just left office. I think it has also served his recent political career well that he adopts many of the extreme positions of the evangelical churches while continuing to be a supposedly devout Catholic. This is most evident in his positions regarding gender and sexuality. He has declared that he'd rather see his sons dead than gay. And famously, he informed a female colleague in the Chamber of Deputies a few years ago that she would, when they were talking about a sexual assault bill, that she was too ugly to be worth raping. Not only has, this is not a paraphrase, this is what he said actually was worse than what I'm saying. Not only has this led to a predictable rise in assaults on gay and trans Brazilians, but it has also become a premise for a crackdown on academic freedom. So the idea of recruiting children into deviant sexual identities. On issues of race and the efforts of Brazilians of African and indigenous descent to claim full rights and equality, Bolsonaro has been similarly blunt. So the quote I referred to at the Jewish Community Center was, quote, "I went to a quilombo," one of the descendant of slaves communities. The least obese Afro-descendant there weighed 250 pounds. They don't do anything. I don't think they're even good for procreating anymore. And then later on in the speech, he said, "If I get to be president, no money will be spent on NGOs. Those bums will have to work." I'm not exactly who those bums are, but you can be sure that if I get to be president, everyone will have a firearm in their home and not one single centimeter will be demarcated for an indigenous reserve or for a quilombola. Bolsonaro's rhetoric may seem so extreme as to eliminate any chance of clever calculation, but at least when he was at the height of his presidential campaign, he had some inkling of when to rein it in. Thus, when the former KKK leader, David Duke, endorsed his campaign, Bolsonaro declined the endorsement, assuring his followers that in a racial democracy like Brazil, it made no sense to court the support of a white supremacist. So he's actually sort of using what is really very much a standard right-wing maneuver in Brazil, which is to say we don't have to do anything for, I can't say minorities, they're a majority, for non-white populations in Brazil, because if they don't suffer any racial discrimination or disadvantage. If they're poor, if they're out of work, it's because they're bums. So. The worst results of his election are already becoming apparent in the areas of greatest tension, particularly, again, the soybean frontier in the Amazon, where there have been a number of killings of community activists. Recently, in an account, somebody quoted a truck driver going by in a Quilombo community yelling, now that Bolsonaro has won, I want to see if there's going to be benefits for blacks. And so, sort of you can see the way in which now things are being very explicitly racialized. And then, of course, there's the issue of the Amazon. I think it's so obvious as to not have to go into it, that when he wants to completely deregulate environmental law, etc., get rid of environmental law. He wants to allow clear cutting of forest. Right now, on indigenous reserves, there's only a 2% degree of deforestation. Out in the areas around indigenous reserves, there's a 70% rate of deforestation. So clearly, one of the things his presidency means, not just for Brazil, but for the whole planet, is in fact drastic environmental damage to the Amazon. And then I'm going to also skip over, because I'm out of time, the discussion of its impact on academic freedom. But I just want to 3 words, okay. So I can talk more about that in the discussion about academic freedom, environment, et cetera. But I just want to go to some of Paul's questions that he asked us to consider. Particularly the question about populism as a useful category of analysis and the broader implications for democracy. If we're working with the Gramscian approach to populism outlined by Ernesto Laclau, then I would say yes, it's useful for thinking about Bolsonaro's electoral victory and his appeal. Certainly Bolsonaro was operating with a discourse of us and them, and a strict notion of legitimate and illegitimate, normal and deviant. His appeal was personalistic and emotional, mito, the myth, rather than formally ideological, and he incorporated elements of religious and popular culture and dismissed intellectuals and technocrats. Furthermore, he went beyond just employing populist rhetoric and hooked into already existing popular movements on the right that had begun protesting Workers' Party policies as early as 2013, again with regional resentment as an organizing theme. And one of the images I wanted to show you was a right-wing protest in which they're carrying signs that in Portuguese it says mais coxinha, menos acarajé, and just very quickly, coxinha would be a snack associated with the south of Brazil. Acarajé is an African-derived snack associated with the northeast of Brazil. So clearly I'm using these foods as symbols for the more legitimate Brazil is the south, the illegitimate Brazil is the north. To be sure, one distinguishing characteristic of Brazilian right-wing populism is the absence of a strong anti-immigrant build up the walls sentiment, because Brazil doesn't attract very many immigrants. But again, what I would say is that the Nordestinos function as immigrants, almost as guest workers in the context of Brazil. Finally, what are the implications for democracy? In a move that vividly reminded Brazilians of who they've elected president, Bolsonaro this week called for preparations to officially commemorate, as in celebrate, the 55th anniversary of the military seizure of power on March 31st, 1964. Bolsonaro also recently caused some embarrassment for the conservative but not fascist president of Chile by praising Pinochet's dictatorship during his visit to that country. And Piñera had to immediately disavow those comments. While this would seem to imply that Bolsonaro is preparing the ground for a military seizure of power, I think that's very unlikely. Such a move would render him completely superfluous. Instead, as with many of the other regimes being discussed today, it seems likely that Bolsonaro's preference and those around him is to maintain some degree of international legitimacy by emphasizing their mandate from the Brazilian people while dismantling as many rights and protections as possible. I should note that this is hardly the first time that a president of Brazil has been someone who endorsed the dictatorship. The first indirectly elected president following the end of the military regime, José Sarney, had been a member of Arena, the pro-military party, up until the last months of the dictatorship. But even Sarney, or maybe especially Sarney, avoided praising the authoritarian regime that preceded him or justifying its use of torture and summary executions. Bolsonaro, in contrast, has never retracted his claim that the only mistake made by the military regime is that it didn't kill more of its opponents. The last book published by my brilliant advisor, Emilia Viotti da Costa, the leading historian of her generation in Brazil, whose career at the University of São Paulo was cut short by the military regime, was a historical study of Brazil's federal Supreme Court. Although Emilia readily acknowledged the tendency of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary in general toward conservatism, she nonetheless felt that its tradition of autonomy could make it a guarantor of rights and a guardian of democracy in the aftermath of the dictatorship. Emilia died in late 2017 at the age of 89, so she was spared the trauma of Bolsonaro's election or of seeing Sergio Moro, the federal judge who oversaw Operation Car Wash in its initial stages, sentence Lula, a still widely admired former president, to 12 years in prison on highly debatable charges. Given that this sentencing of Lula, which made him ineligible to run in the most recent election, may well have been the single most crucial development in favor of Bolsonaro's victory, one could only watch with horror as 4 days after the election, Sergio Moro, who always claimed to be uninterested in politics, agreed to be Bolsonaro's Minister of Justice and Public Safety. And since assuming his post, he has pursued policies that are precisely what one would expect from Bolsonaro's Minister of Justice.